bear cub was locked in a cage on a sinking ship. What this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The rain hammered against the deck of the cargo ship like angry fists. Captain Ryland Knox wiped salt water from his eyes as another massive wave crashed over the bow, sending icy spray across the metal surface. The ship groaned and creaked, fighting against the storm that had come out of nowhere. Down in the lower cargo hold, 17-month-old Willow sat in her travel crib, her tiny hands gripping the fabric sides. Her parents, marine biologists Dr. Clara and Dr. Marcus Finch, had been forced to bring her along on this emergency rescue mission. They were transporting endangered animals from a failed wildlife sanctuary to a new facility, but now everything had gone wrong. The ship tilted sharply to the left, and Willow's crib slid several feet across the floor. She didn't cry like most babies would. Instead, she looked around with those bright blue eyes, as if she was trying to understand what was happening. The cargo hold was dim, lit only by a few emergency lights that flickered each time the ship rocked. In the far corner, barely visible in the shadows, something moved. A small brown shape pressed against metal bars, whimpering softly. It was a 6-month-old bear cub, locked in a transport cage that was meant to keep him safe during the journey. But now, with water beginning to seep through the ship's hull, the cage had become a trap. The cub's name was Bear, a simple name given by the sanctuary workers who had raised him from birth. His mother had been killed by poachers, and he had never known life in the wild. All he knew was the kindness of humans who fed him and played with him. But those humans weren't here now. Clara rushed past Willow's crib, her face pale with worry. "Marcus, the pumps can't keep up with the water coming in," she called to her husband, who was checking on the other animals in their cages. "Captain Knox says we might have to abandon ship." Marcus stopped what he was doing and looked at his wife with fear in his eyes. "What about the animals? We can't just leave them here. The lifeboats can only hold so many." Clara's voice trailed off as she realized what that meant. Some of the animals they had worked so hard to save might be lost anyway. Willow listened to her parents' worried voices, though she couldn't understand their words. But she could feel the fear in the air, the way the ship shook beneath them, the cold draft that meant something was very wrong. Most of all, she could hear that sad sound coming from the dark corner, a sound that made her chest feel funny. The bear cub had been quiet for most of the journey, curled up in the back of his cage. But as the ship started taking on water, his instincts told him to find higher ground, to escape. He pressed his small body against the cage door, pushing with all his strength, but the lock held firm. Water began pooling around the base of his cage, creeping higher with each wave that hit the ship. Bear stood on his hind legs, pressing his paws against the top of the cage, trying to find a way out. His dark eyes reflected the emergency lights as he looked around desperately. Willow heard the splashing sounds getting closer. The water was spreading across the floor of the cargo hold, reaching toward her crib. She pulled herself up to standing, holding on to the mesh sides, and peered in the direction of that sad sound. That's when she saw him. Through the dim light and shadows, Willow saw the small bear pressed against his cage, water now covering his paws. Their eyes met across the cargo hold, and something passed between them. A recognition that neither was meant to be in this frightening place, that both needed help. Willow did something she had never done before. She climbed over the side of her crib. Her parents had always wondered when she would start trying to escape her crib like other toddlers her age, but Willow had always been content to stay put, playing quietly with her toys. Now, driven by something she couldn't name, She lowered herself down into the cold water that covered the floor. The shock of the water made her gasp, but she didn't cry. Instead, she began moving toward the cage where Bear waited, his whimpers growing more urgent as the water level rose. The water was ankle-deep now, and each step was a struggle for Willow's small legs. She had only been walking for 3 months, and moving through water was completely different. Her tiny hands reached out for balance as she stumbled forward, her eyes never leaving the bear cub who watched her approach with growing hope in his dark eyes. Bear pressed his nose against the cage bars, sniffing in Willow's direction. He had been around humans his whole life, but never one so small, never one that seemed to understand his fear the way this little human did. His whimpers softened into small huffing sounds, as if he was trying to talk to her. Above them, footsteps pounded across the deck. Captain Knox's voice boomed over the ship's intercom, crackling with static. All passengers and crew to the main deck immediately. This is not a drill. Abandoned ship procedures are now in effect. Clara froze when she heard the announcement. She looked around the cargo hold, mentally counting the cages, knowing they couldn't possibly save all the animals. Her heart broke as she realized that some of these creatures who had already suffered so much would not survive the night. "We have to get Willow and go," Marcus said, grabbing a life jacket from a storage locker. But when they turned toward the crib, it was empty. "Willow!" Clara screamed, her voice echoing off the metal walls. "Where is she?" The water was rising faster now. What had been a thin layer on the floor was now deep enough to slosh against the lower cages. The animals were getting restless, sensing the danger. A pair of young wolves paced in their enclosure, while a family of raccoons huddled together in the highest corner of their cage. Willow was halfway to Bear's cage when she heard her mother calling her name. She looked back for a moment, seeing her parents searching frantically, their faces full of terror. But the bear cub made a sound that drew her attention back, a sound that was almost like crying. Bear had never felt water this cold before. It was creeping up his legs now, making his fur heavy and wet. He had tried everything he could think of to get out, pushing, pulling, even trying to bite the metal bars. Nothing worked. The lock was too complex for his young mind to understand, requiring human hands to open it properly. But now this small human was coming closer, moving through the water that scared him so much. Bear reached one paw through the bars, stretching as far as he could toward Willow. His claws were retracted, something he did instinctively around humans who were kind to him. Willow saw the paw reaching for her and stretched out her own tiny hand. When their fingers and paw touched, something extraordinary happened. Bear stopped whimpering completely, and Willow smiled for the first time since the storm began. In that moment, neither of them felt alone anymore. The ship lurched violently to the right, sending a wave of water crashing through the cargo hold. Willow lost her balance and fell, disappearing under the surface for a terrifying second before bobbing back up, sputtering and coughing. Bear roared. Not the playful sound he usually made, but a deep, desperate call that seemed far too big for his small body. That roar saved Willow's life. Marcus heard it and spun around, finally spotting his daughter in the water near the bear's cage. "Clara, she's here!" he shouted, splashing through the water toward them. But as Marcus moved closer, something unexpected happened. Bear growled, not at Willow, but at Marcus. The cub had bonded with the baby in those few precious moments, and now saw the approaching adult as a potential threat to his new friend. "Easy, buddy," Marcus said softly, slowing his approach. He had worked with animals his whole career and recognized the protective behavior. "I'm not going to hurt her. She's my baby." Bear tilted his head, studying Marcus's face and voice. The man smelled like the baby. Similar sense of warmth and milk and kindness. Slowly, the cub's growl faded, replaced by uncertain whines. Willow had managed to pull herself up against Bear's cage, using the bars to stand. Water dripped from her dark hair as she looked up at her father, then back at Bear. She pressed her small hand against the cage door, right where the lock was located. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his heart race with a different kind of fear. The lock on Bear's cage was broken. Not completely, it was still holding the door closed, but the metal had been weakened by rust and the constant battering of the storm. One good hit, and it would give way completely. The problem was, if Bear got out now, in a panic, in a flooding ship, there was no telling what he might do. A scared wild animal was dangerous, even a young one. But if they left him in the cage, he would certainly drown. Clara appeared beside Marcus, relief flooding her face when she saw Willow safe. But that relief quickly turned to worry when she saw the situation they were in. "The water's rising too fast," she said. "We have maybe 5 minutes before this whole section is underwater." Above them, they could hear other crew members shouting, the sounds of equipment being moved, engines straining against the storm. But down in the cargo hold, it felt like they were in a separate world, cut off from any possible rescue. Willow looked up at her parents, then back at Bear, who was now standing in water up to his belly. She could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt when thunderstorms woke her up at night. Without thinking about what she was doing, she grabbed the cage lock with both hands and pulled. The rusted metal gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the cargo hold. Bear's cage door swung open, and suddenly he was free. For a moment, nobody moved. Bear stood in the doorway of his cage, water swirling around his legs, looking at the 3 humans who had just saved his life. This was his chance to run, to escape, to find higher ground and safety. Instead, he stepped forward and gently nuzzled Willow's hand. "Oh my God," Clara whispered, tears mixing with the salt water on her cheeks. He's thanking her. But their moment of wonder was interrupted by a new sound, metal groaning and tearing. Somewhere in the ship's hull, a support beam had given way. The angle of the floor was getting steeper, and the water was rushing in faster than ever. "We have to go now," Marcus said, reaching for Willow. But as he moved forward, Bear stepped between them, looking uncertain. The cub was free from his cage, but now he faced a new dilemma. Should he follow these humans who had freed him, or trust his instincts and find his own way to safety? Willow solved the problem by sitting down in the water and holding out her arms to Bear. The cub looked at her for a moment, then carefully walked into her embrace. She wrapped her tiny arms around his wet fur as best she could, and he leaned against her, both of them drawing comfort from each other's presence. Marcus realized he couldn't separate them now, not after what had just happened. "We all go together," he decided, lifting Willow while making sure Bear could follow close beside them. As they began making their way through the flooded cargo hold toward the stairs, none of them noticed the other cages beginning to shift and tip as the ship listed further. They were focused on getting out alive, on getting to the lifeboats, on surviving this nightmare. But Bear's escape had started something that would change everything. Because when dangerous animals are freed in a crisis, sometimes the most unexpected alliances are formed. And sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples of consequence. The water was already waist-deep and rising fast as they reached the base of the stairs. And above them they could hear other sounds now. Not just human voices, but the calls of frightened animals who had also found ways out of their cages. The cargo hold they were trying to escape was becoming something else entirely. A place where the rules of captivity no longer applied, where survival would depend on cooperation between species that had never chosen to trust each other before. Marcus struggled to carry Willow while keeping his balance on the tilted, slippery stairs. Each step was treacherous as the metal was slick with water and the ship continued to list further to one side. Bear stayed close to Willow, his small claws providing better grip on the wet surface than Marcus's boots. Halfway up the stairs, they heard a tremendous crashing sound from somewhere behind them. Clara looked back and gasped. In the dim emergency lighting, she could see shapes moving through the water, animals that had broken free from their damaged cages. A family of otters swam past, their sleek bodies cutting through the murky water with ease. 2 young wolves had found refuge on top of a floating crate, their yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Marcus, look," Clara whispered, pointing to something that made them all stop in their tracks. Near the far end of the cargo hold, an elderly orangutan sat on top of his overturned cage, his long arms keeping him well above the water. In his hands, he held something carefully, a baby monkey that had somehow gotten separated from its mother in the chaos. The orangutan was cradling the infant, protecting it just as Willow was protecting Bear. "They're helping each other," Marcus said in amazement. "The animals, they're working together." Bear made a soft chuffing sound and pressed closer to Willow. He understood, in his simple way, that something important was happening. These weren't just scared animals trapped in a sinking ship anymore. They were survivors, looking out for each other in ways that went beyond species. They reached the top of the stairs and emerged onto the ship's main deck, where chaos reigned. Crew members ran back and forth, securing lifeboats and helping passengers into life jackets. The storm was still raging, with rain coming down so hard it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Captain Knox spotted them immediately. Dr. Finch, what are you doing with that animal? All wildlife must remain in the cargo hold per maritime safety regulations." "The cargo hold is flooding, Captain," Marcus shouted over the wind. "The animals will drown if we leave them down there." "That's not my concern right now," Knox replied, his face grim. "I have 47 human passengers to get off this ship safely. The lifeboats have limited capacity." Bear sensed the tension in the adults' voices and pressed himself against Willow's side. She wrapped her small arms around him tighter, somehow understanding that people wanted to separate them. Her bottom lip began to quiver, the first sign she might cry since this whole ordeal began. "You can't separate them now," Clara said firmly. "Look at them, Captain. They're bonded. Traumatizing them further won't help anyone." Before Captain Knox could respond, First Officer Diana Torres appeared at his side, her radio crackling with static. "Captain, we have a problem. The cargo hold doors have been breached. Several animals have escaped and are now on the lower decks." Knox's face went pale. "How many animals?" "What species?" "Unknown, sir. The water's too deep to get a clear count, but sensors show movement throughout the ship." As if summoned by their conversation, a small group of animals emerged onto the main deck. The 2 wolves they had seen earlier trotted out together, followed by the orangutan still carrying the baby monkey. Behind them came a young deer, its legs trembling, but its head held high. The human passengers who were waiting for the lifeboats began to panic. Some screamed, others backed away toward the ship's rails. But something unexpected happened next. Willow began to babble and coo at the animals, making the same gentle sounds she used to make at Bear. The animals, stressed and frightened, seemed to calm at the sound of her voice. The wolves stopped their nervous pacing and sat down, tilting their heads as they listened to her. The deer took a step closer, its large dark eyes fixed on the baby. "She's communicating with them," Torres said in wonder. "How is that possible?" Clara had noticed this about Willow before, but never to this extent. Her daughter had always been unusually calm around animals, But this was different. It was as if she spoke a language that transcended species barriers. Bear stood up on his hind legs, placing his front paws on Willow's shoulders in a gesture that looked almost protective. He looked around at the other animals, then back at the humans, as if he was trying to bridge the gap between both worlds. "Captain," Marcus said, an idea forming in his mind, "what if we use this? What if we don't try to fight what's happening here?" "What do you mean?" Knox asked, though his attention was divided between the conversation and the continuing evacuation efforts. "I mean, what if we work with the animals instead of against them? They're calmer around Willow. Maybe we can get them onto the lifeboats without anyone getting hurt." Knox stared at Marcus as if he had suggested something completely insane. "You want me to put wild animals on lifeboats with human passengers?" "They're not wild right now," Clara pointed out. "Look at them. They're traumatized and scared, just like we are. And they're following Willow's lead." The ship lurched again, this time more severely than before. Several passengers lost their balance, and one of the lifeboats swung dangerously close to the deck rail. The wolves instinctively moved closer to Willow and Bear, seeking comfort in their presence. "Oh, we're running out of time," Torres warned. "The ship won't stay afloat much longer." Captain Knox looked around at the chaos on his deck, then down at the small group centered around a baby and a bear cub. It went against everything he had been trained to do, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "All right," he decided. "But the animals go in the last lifeboat, with the Finch family. If anything goes wrong, I'm not risking other passengers." Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you, Captain." As they prepared to load the animals into the designated lifeboat, more creatures began appearing on deck. A family of raccoons scurried up from below, followed by what appeared to be a young fox with an injured paw. Each time a new animal appeared, the humans grew more nervous, but Willow's presence seemed to keep them calm. Bear had taken it upon himself to greet each newcomer, sniffing them and making soft sounds that seemed to reassure them. It was as if he had become Willow's ambassador to the animal kingdom, helping her communicate with species she had never encountered before. "This is incredible," Torres murmured, watching the interaction. "I've never seen anything like it." But their wonder was interrupted by a new sound from below deck, a deep, rumbling roar that made everyone freeze. This wasn't the gentle sound Bear made, or the whimpering of frightened, smaller animals. This was something much larger and potentially much more dangerous. "What was that?" Knox demanded. Torres checked her radio, her face growing pale as she listened to reports from the crew. "Captain, it's coming from the lower cargo deck, the exotic animals section. Something big has gotten out." The roar came again, closer this time, and then they saw it. A magnificent Bengal tiger, its orange and black stripes glistening with water, emerging from the stairwell with powerful, fluid movements. The passengers on deck began screaming and running toward the lifeboats, pushing and shoving in their panic. The smaller animals that had been calmly following Willow suddenly scattered, their instincts telling them to flee from this apex predator. But Bear didn't run. Instead, he positioned himself between Willow and the tiger, his small body trembling but his stance determined. He let out a series of huffs and grunts, sounds that seemed to carry more meaning than his usual vocalizations. The tiger stopped and looked down at the tiny bear cub standing in its path. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the two animals stared at each other. The tiger's golden eyes held intelligence and sadness, and something else, a recognition of the courage it saw in the much smaller creature before it. Willow, seemingly unaware of the danger, reached out her hand toward the tiger and made the same soft cooing sounds she had been using all along. The great cat took a step closer, its massive head lowering until it was almost at Willow's level. "Nobody move," Marcus whispered urgently. "Don't make any sudden movements." But what happened next defied all logic and expectation. The tiger, this powerful predator that could easily harm any of them, gently touched its nose to Willow's outstretched hand. Then it lay down on the wet deck, making itself smaller and less threatening, and began to purr. The sound of the tiger's purr seemed to call the other animals back. One by one, they crept closer again, forming a loose circle around Willow, Bear, and now the tiger. It was as if the baby had somehow created a sanctuary of peace in the middle of the storm and chaos. "How is this possible?" Captain Knox asked in a voice filled with awe. Clara watched her daughter, this tiny human being who had somehow become the center of an impossible moment. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think Willow sees something in them that we don't. She doesn't see dangerous animals. She just sees other living beings who are scared and need help." The tiger lifted its great head and looked directly at Clara, as if it understood her words. In that moment, Clara felt something she had never experienced before, a connection with a wild animal that went beyond fear or caution. She saw intelligence there, and gratitude, and a deep sadness that spoke of loss and captivity and the desire for freedom. "We have to take them all," she said suddenly. "All of them. We can't leave any behind." Knox shook his head. "It's impossible. The lifeboats weren't designed for this many passengers, human or animal." "Then we make it work," Marcus said firmly. "Because right now, Willow is the only thing keeping these animals calm. If we try to separate them, there's no telling what might happen." The ship gave another violent lurch, and they could hear the sound of more metal tearing below deck. Time was running out, and they had to make a decision that would determine not just their own fate, but the fate of every creature on this sinking vessel. First Officer Torres grabbed Captain Knox's arm, her eyes wide with urgency. "Sir, the engine room just reported catastrophic flooding. We have maybe 20 minutes before complete structural failure." Knox looked at the extraordinary scene before him. A baby girl surrounded by wild animals, all of them somehow peaceful in her presence. His training told him to prioritize human life, but his heart was telling him something different. These weren't just animals anymore. They were refugees, just like the human passengers. "All right," he said finally, his voice carrying across the deck over the howling wind. "Emergency Evacuation Protocol 7. All available lifeboats will be used. Animals will be distributed across multiple boats with volunteer human companions." "Captain, that's against maritime law," Torres protested quietly. "So is abandoning creatures to drown when we have the means to save them," Knox replied. "And I've never seen anything like what's happening here. That baby, she's keeping them calm. Without her, we'd have a deck full of panicked animals and injured passengers." As if responding to his words, more animals began emerging from the lower decks. A pair of young lynx with spotted coats picked their way carefully across the wet surface, their large paws helping them maintain balance. Behind them came a small group of exotic birds, a scarlet macaw, 2 white cockatoos, and a brilliant blue jay. Their feathers bedraggled, but their spirits unbroken. Willow clapped her hands together when she saw the birds, making delighted, gurgling sounds. The macaw tilted its head and squawked back, almost as if it was trying to have a conversation with her. Bear watched this interaction with what could only be described as amusement, his small tail wagging slightly. "How many animals were on this ship?" Marcus asked Torres as he watched more creatures appear. "The manifest listed 47 animals of various species," she replied, consulting her waterlogged clipboard. But some cages held family groups, so the actual number is closer to 75. Clara felt her heart sink. 75 animals plus 47 human passengers and crew. Even with all their lifeboats, it would be an impossible fit. But Willow seemed oblivious to the mathematics of survival. She had begun moving among the animals, touching each one gently, making soft sounds that seemed to calm their fears. The tiger followed her like a massive, striped shadow, its presence actually reassuring the smaller animals rather than frightening them. Dr. Rebecca Santos, the ship's veterinarian who had been helping to tend to seasick passengers, finally made it up to the main deck. She stopped dead when she saw the scene before her. "Dear God," she whispered, "how did they all get out?" "The cages were damaged in the storm," Marcus explained. "But Rebecca, you have to see this. They're not acting like wild animals, they're acting like a family." Rebecca watched in amazement as Willow approached an injured young deer that was favoring its right front leg. The baby reached out her hand, and the deer lowered its head, allowing her to gently touch its forehead. Almost immediately, the deer seemed calmer, less focused on its pain. "That's impossible," Rebecca murmured. "Animals don't respond to human contact like that, especially when they're injured and stressed." "Then explain what we're seeing," Clara challenged. Before Rebecca could answer, a new commotion arose from the far side of the deck. A group of passengers had cornered 3 young monkeys near the ship's railing, trying to force them back toward the stairwell with a deck chair. "Get back! Get back!" A man in an expensive suit was shouting. "Someone needs to control these beasts." The monkeys were chittering in fear, their small bodies pressed against the railing with nowhere to go. One of them, barely more than a baby itself, was crying, actual tears streaming down its furry face. Bear heard the distress calls and immediately began running toward the commotion, with Willow crawling as fast as she could behind him. The tiger rose to follow, its powerful stride quickly overtaking the baby bear. "Oh no," Torres breathed. "This could go very wrong, very fast." But what happened next surprised everyone. When the tiger appeared, the aggressive passengers immediately backed away, dropping the chair they had been using as a weapon, but the tiger ignored them completely. Instead, it positioned itself between the frightened monkeys and the humans, lying down to make itself appear less threatening while still serving as a barrier. Bear reached the monkeys first and began making soft, reassuring sounds. The baby monkey stopped crying and reached out to touch Bear's nose. Within moments, Willow arrived and sat down on the wet deck between all of them, creating what could only be described as a peace summit. The man in the suit looked furious. "This is ridiculous. I paid for passage on a luxury cruise, not a floating zoo." "Sir, please return to your assigned lifeboat station," Captain Knox ordered firmly. "And I'll remind you that this is a rescue ship, not a cruise vessel. These animals are refugees just like you." Dr. Santos had been watching Willow interact with the injured deer, and her scientific mind was struggling to process what she was seeing. "Marcus, Clara, I need to tell you something. That baby of yours, she's doing something that shouldn't be possible." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "I mean she's somehow projecting a calming pheromone or energy that's affecting the animal's stress responses. I've studied animal behavior for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Marcus looked skeptical. "Are you saying our daughter has some kind of supernatural ability?" "I'm saying she has a natural affinity that goes beyond normal human capabilities. Some people have perfect pitch or photographic memories. Your daughter appears to have perfect empathy, at least with animals." Their conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crash from below deck. The lights flickered, and several passengers screamed as the ship listed even further to one side. They could hear the sound of rushing water, much closer now than before. "That's it," Knox announced. "All passengers and animals into the lifeboats now. No exceptions." The evacuation that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Willow was placed in the largest lifeboat with Bear, the tiger, and several other animals. But instead of chaos, there was an eerie calm. The animals seemed to understand that they needed to work together to survive. The orangutan helped load the smaller monkeys, his long arms reaching out to guide them safely into the boat. The wolves positioned themselves at the edges, acting as sentries. The deer lay down in the center, creating a calm focal point for the other creatures. In another lifeboat, the lynx curled up next to a family of raccoons, while the exotic birds perched on the edges, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray storm clouds overhead. Dr. Santos, who volunteered to accompany the animals, watched in professional amazement as species that would normally be predator and prey coexisted peacefully. "It's like she's created a temporary ecosystem," Rebecca told Clara as they prepared to lower the boats, "a place where normal animal instincts have been overridden by something else." Clara looked at her daughter, who was sitting peacefully in the center of the lifeboat with Bear in her lap and the tiger's massive head resting near her feet. "What happens when we reach shore? Will this connection last?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "But I think your daughter is going to change how we understand the relationship between humans and animals." As the lifeboats were lowered into the churning ocean, the storm seemed to sense the drama of the moment. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the surreal scene of humans and wild animals sharing the same small boats, united in their struggle for survival. The ship behind them groaned and tilted further, its lights beginning to flicker and fail. But in the lifeboats, surrounded by the sound of wind and waves, there was something that transcended fear. Willow had begun humming, a wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. The animals responded to the sound, adding their own voices. Bear huffed softly in rhythm, the tiger's purr provided a low bass note, and the birds added high, sweet harmonies. Even the humans found themselves affected by the music. The crying stopped, the panic subsided, and for a moment they forgot about the sinking ship and the uncertainty ahead. They were simply living beings sharing a moment of peace in the middle of a storm. But the calm was shattered when someone in another lifeboat screamed, "There's something in the water!" Everyone looked toward where the person was pointing. In the dark water between the lifeboats, shapes were moving, large, dark shapes that cut through the waves with purposeful motion. "Sharks!" someone called out in terror. Dr. Santos peered into the water, trying to make out what they were seeing. "No," she said slowly. "Not sharks. Whales. They're whales." As if summoned by Willow's humming, a pod of pilot whales had appeared, their sleek bodies gliding through the water around the lifeboats. But they weren't attacking or threatening. They were swimming in a protective circle, as if they were escorting the refugees to safety. The lead whale surfaced near Willow's lifeboat, its large, intelligent eye looking directly at the baby. Willow stopped humming and reached out her hand toward the water. The whale moved closer, allowing her tiny fingers to brush against its smooth skin. In that moment, everyone in the lifeboats understood that they were witnessing something beyond their comprehension. A connection between species that transcended the boundaries of land and sea, predator and prey, wild and domestic. The whales began to sing, their deep, haunting calls echoing across the water. Other creatures joined in. Dolphins appeared, their clicks and whistles adding to the chorus. Even the tiger added his voice, a low rumble that harmonized with the whale song. Captain Knox, in the lead lifeboat, radioed the Coast Guard with shaking hands. "Coast Guard, This is Captain Knox of the research vessel Marina's Hope. We have successfully evacuated all passengers and cargo, but you're not going to believe what we're seeing out here." As rescue ships appeared on the horizon, their lights cutting through the storm, the whales continued their protective circle. The animals in the lifeboats remained calm, still influenced by Willow's presence and the extraordinary bond that had formed between them. But as they approached the rescue vessels, a new challenge emerged. How do you explain to authorities that a 17-month-old baby had somehow created peace between natural enemies? How do you convince them that these wild animals posed no threat as long as they remained near her? Dr. Santos looked at the approaching Coast Guard cutters and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean spray. She knew what would happen next. The animals would be separated, placed in quarantine, sent to different facilities. The magic of this moment would be broken by bureaucracy and protocol. "Clara," she said urgently, "when we reach the rescue ship, they're going to want to separate the animals from Willow. We can't let that happen." "Not yet." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. I think your daughter is the key to something revolutionary. A way of understanding animal consciousness that could change everything. But if we lose this connection now, we might never get it back." As the first rescue boat pulled alongside their lifeboat, its crew members stared in disbelief at the scene before them. A baby surrounded by wild animals, all of them peaceful and calm despite having just survived a shipwreck. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to hand over the child and step away from those animals," the lead rescuer called out. Bear growled softly, and the tiger's eyes fixed on the approaching humans with a look that was both intelligent and warning. The other animals tensed, sensing that their sanctuary was about to be disrupted. Willow looked up at her mother with those wide blue eyes, as if she understood that something was about to change. She reached out her arms to Clara, but she didn't let go of Bear. "Please," Clara called to the rescuers. "You don't understand. They're not dangerous. She's connected to them somehow." But the rescue team had protocols to follow, and a boat full of wild animals wasn't part of any manual they had studied. As they prepared to separate Willow from her animal companions, the whales around them began to call louder, their songs taking on an urgent, almost pleading quality. The storm itself seemed to respond, the wind picking up and the waves growing larger. It was as if the ocean itself was trying to protect the extraordinary bond that had formed in the middle of its chaos. But human rules and regulations were about to put that bond to its ultimate test. The lead Coast Guard officer, Commander Sarah Blake, had been conducting marine rescues for over 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this. Her training told her to secure the humans first and deal with the animals as a secondary concern. But the scene before her defied all logic and protocol. "Dr. Finch," she called out, consulting the passenger manifest. "We need to get you and your family aboard immediately. Our veterinary team will handle the animals." Clara shook her head firmly. "Commander, with all due respect, you don't understand the situation. These animals aren't just cargo. They're connected to my daughter in a way I can't explain." Bear sensed the tension in Clara's voice and moved protectively closer to Willow. The tiger, who had been lying peacefully beside them, slowly rose to its feet, its golden eyes fixed on the approaching Coast Guard personnel. Though its posture wasn't aggressive, there was an unmistakable message in its stance. Approach with caution. Dr. Santos leaned forward urgently. "Commander Blake, I'm Dr. Rebecca Santos, marine veterinarian. I've been documenting what's happening here, and I strongly advise against separating the baby from these animals right now. Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but we have a medical team standing by, and these wild animals pose a significant risk to..." Commander Blake's words were cut off by the most extraordinary sound any of them had ever heard. Willow had begun to sing. It wasn't the babbling or cooing she had been doing before. This was a clear, melodic sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 17 months of life. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, with notes that seemed to rise and fall like the ocean waves themselves. Every animal in every lifeboat immediately responded. Bear pressed his small body against Willow's side, adding his own soft huffs to her song. The tiger's purr deepened, creating a resonant bass that vibrated through the boat. The wolves lifted their heads and howled softly, their voices intertwining with hers in perfect harmony. But the most incredible response came from the ocean itself. The pilot whales around them began singing back, their deep calls answering Willow's melody. More marine life appeared as if drawn by the sound, dolphins leaping through the waves, their clicks and whistles joining the chorus. Even the seabirds overhead seemed to time their cries to match the rhythm. Commander Blake found herself speechless, her hand frozen halfway to her radio. The other Coast Guard personnel stood slack-jawed, their emergency equipment forgotten as they witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. "My God," Blake whispered. "What is she?" Dr. Santos was furiously taking notes, her scientific mind trying to process what she was seeing. "She's creating a harmonic frequency that's resonating across the species lines. It's impossible, but it's happening right in front of us." The song continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When Willow finally stopped, the silence that followed was profound. Every creature, human and animal alike, seemed to be holding its breath. Then, something unexpected happened. A new boat approached from the distance, but this wasn't a Coast Guard vessel. It was smaller, older, with the weathered look of a boat that had spent many years at sea. At its bow stood an elderly woman with silver hair whipping in the wind, her eyes focused intently on the lifeboats. "Who is that?" Commander Blake demanded, raising her binoculars. The woman's boat pulled alongside the lifeboat containing Willow and the animals. She looked directly at the baby with eyes that held a strange mixture of recognition and awe. "I am Dr. Elena Vasquez," she called out, her accent hinting at Spanish origins. "Marine biologist and cetacean communications specialist. I've been tracking unusual whale song patterns for the past hour, and they led me here." Dr. Santos looked up from her notes. "Dr. Vasquez? I know your work. You're the one who deciphered the humpback whale navigation songs." Elena nodded, but her attention remained fixed on Willow. "And in 40 years of studying marine communication, I have never heard anything like what I just witnessed. That child, she spoke to them in their own language." "That's impossible," Commander Blake protested. "She's barely more than a baby." "Is it?" Elena asked. "Commander, look around you. Look at what's happening here. A storm that should have scattered this pod of whales has instead brought them together. Animals that should be terrified are calm. Predators and prey are sharing space peacefully. And it all centers on one child." As if to prove her point, one of the pilot whales surfaced next to Elena's boat. The massive creature looked directly at Willow and made a series of gentle, questioning sounds. Willow responded with her own soft vocalizations, and the whale's reply was immediate and enthusiastic. "They're talking to each other," Elena said with reverence, "actually communicating." Bear had been listening intently to this exchange between Willow and the whale. Suddenly, he stood up in the lifeboat and made his own sounds, different from his usual huffs and grunts. These were more complex, almost like he was trying to translate between the baby and the whale. The tiger seemed to understand what Bear was doing and added its own voice to the conversation. Soon, All the animals in the lifeboats were participating, creating a complex dialogue that transcended species boundaries. Dr. Santos was writing frantically, trying to capture every detail. Elena, are you getting this? We're witnessing the emergence of a universal animal language. I'm recording everything, Elena replied, holding up a waterproof device. But I think we're seeing something even more significant than that. Commander Blake, despite her amazement at what was happening, had a job to do. This is all very fascinating, but I have orders to evacuate these survivors. The storm isn't over, and we need to get everyone to safety. Commander, Elena said urgently, if you separate this child from these animals now, you may be destroying something that could revolutionize our understanding of interspecies communication. Please, give us some time. How much time? Blake asked reluctantly. Before Elena could answer, the pilot whale that had been communicating with Willow made a series of urgent calls. The other whales responded immediately, and the entire pod began swimming in the same direction. Bear heard the whales and began making distressed sounds. He looked at Willow, then at the whales, then back at her, as if he was trying to tell her something important. Willow followed Bear's gaze and seemed to understand. She pointed in the direction the whales were heading and made her own urgent sounds. The other animals in the lifeboats became agitated, clearly feeling the same urgency. They're trying to tell us something, Elena realized. The whales are warning us about something. Dr. Santos looked at her instruments. Elena, my equipment is picking up seismic activity in that direction. There could be... Her words were cut off by a tremendous rumbling sound from beneath the ocean. The water around them began to churn, and in the distance they could see something rising from the depths. Underwater landslide, Commander Blake said grimly. The earthquake activity must have destabilized the sea floor. That's going to create a massive wave. The whales' warning calls became more urgent, and they began swimming rapidly away from the approaching danger. But instead of abandoning the lifeboats, they positioned themselves on the far side, as if they were trying to shield the humans and animals from what was coming. All boats, emergency maneuvers, Blake shouted into her radio. We have a tsunami wave approaching from the northeast. The Coast Guard vessels began moving at full speed, but the lifeboats were too slow and too low in the water to outrun what was approaching. Fear gripped everyone as they realized they were about to face another disaster just when they thought they were safe. But Willow seemed completely calm. She stood up in the lifeboat, her small hands gripping the side, and began to sing again. This time, her song was different, faster, more urgent, but still hauntingly beautiful. The whales responded immediately, their own songs becoming more complex and coordinated. And then, something miraculous happened. More whales appeared, not just pilot whales, but humpbacks, greys, and even a small group of orcas. They formed a living barrier between the lifeboats and the approaching wave, their massive bodies creating a breakwater. That's not possible, Commander Blake breathed. Whales don't behave like that. These whales do, Elena said, tears streaming down her face. That child has called them to protect us. The wave hit the whale barrier with tremendous force, but the massive creatures held their position. Some were pushed underwater by the impact, but they quickly resurfaced, their songs never stopping. The wave that should have destroyed the lifeboats was broken and dispersed by the living wall of whale flesh. As the danger passed and the water began to calm, the whales' songs changed again, this time to something that sounded almost celebratory. They began swimming around the lifeboats in a joyful pattern, occasionally surfacing to spray water into the air like a natural fireworks display. Willow clapped her hands and laughed, the first truly happy sound she had made since the ordeal began. Bear jumped up and down excitedly. and the other animals joined in what could only be described as a celebration. Commander Blake stared at the scene in amazement. How do I write this up in my report? Who's going to believe that a baby commanded whales to save us from a tsunami? Elena climbed into the lifeboat with Willow and the animals, ignoring protocol and the potential danger. Commander, what if I told you that there have been legends about humans like this in cultures around the world? People who could speak to animals, who could call them for help in times of need. You're talking about myths and fairy tales, Blake replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Am I? Elena asked. Look at this child. Look at what just happened. Maybe our ancestors weren't telling stories. Maybe they were recording history. Dr. Santos looked up from her instruments, her face pale with excitement. Elena, I'm reading something extraordinary. The brainwave patterns I'm picking up from Willow, they're synchronizing with the whale's echolocation frequencies. What does that mean? Clara asked, holding her daughter closer. It means, Elena explained slowly, that your daughter's brain might be able to process and generate the same types of neural signals that whales use to communicate. She's not just talking to them, she's thinking like them. The implications of this discovery began to sink in for everyone in the lifeboats. They weren't just witnessing an unusual event, they were seeing the emergence of something that could change humanity's relationship with the natural world forever. But as the rescue operation continued and more official vessels arrived on the scene, new challenges emerged. Government officials began arriving, asking questions, demanding explanations. Scientists from various institutions requested permission to study Willow. Media helicopters appeared overhead, their cameras capturing images that would soon be broadcast around the world. Dr. Vasquez pulled Clara and Marcus aside as they prepared to transfer to the main rescue vessel. Listen to me very carefully, she said urgently. There are going to be people who want to treat your daughter like a laboratory specimen. They'll want to study her, test her, maybe even confine her to understand her abilities. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that after today, your lives will never be the same. Everyone is going to want a piece of this miracle. But you have to remember, Willow is still just a baby. She needs protection, not exploitation. Marcus nodded grimly. What do you suggest we do? Stay together. Don't let anyone separate you from the animals unless absolutely necessary. And remember, the connection your daughter has made here today might be the key to healing the relationship between humans and the natural world, but only if it's nurtured properly. As they were finally transferred to the rescue ship, the whales continued to follow, their songs carrying across the water like a promise. Bear stayed close to Willow throughout the transfer, refusing to be separated from her even when the ship's crew tried to take him to the animal containment area. The tiger presented a bigger challenge. Its size made it impossible for it to be in close quarters with the human passengers, but every time someone tried to move it away from Willow, it became agitated and stressed. Finally, a compromise was reached. The tiger would be kept in a modified cargo area, where Willow could visit it regularly. As the rescue ship headed toward port, word of the miracle at sea was already spreading. News crews were gathering at the harbor. Government officials were making calls, and scientists from around the world were booking flights to witness this phenomenon firsthand. But in the small cabin where the Finch family had been given quarters, a quiet moment of normalcy had settled. Willow sat on her father's lap while Bear curled up beside her, both of them finally able to rest after their extraordinary adventure. Clara looked out the porthole at the whales still following their ship, their dark forms visible just beneath the surface. Marcus, she said softly, our daughter just changed the world. I know, he replied, stroking Willow's hair. The question is, what kind of world is she going to grow up in now? Outside their cabin, the sounds of the ship carried on as usual. Crew members calling out orders, passengers talking about their rescue, the engines humming steadily toward home. But underneath it all, if you listened carefully, you could still hear the distant songs of the whales, carrying a message of connection and hope across the endless ocean. The rescue was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. Because when a child can speak the language of the sea, she opens doorways that can never be closed again. And sometimes, those doorways lead to wonders that the world has never imagined. As the rescue ship approached the harbor, the whales that had been following them began to sing one final time. Their voices rose together in a melody so beautiful that even the hardened crew members stopped what they were doing to listen. The song seemed to carry across the water, reaching the shore where crowds had gathered to witness the arrival of the survivors. Willow stood at the ship's railing, held safely in her father's arms, with Bear pressed against her side. She listened to the whale song with a peaceful expression, as if she understood every note. Then, surprising everyone, she began to sing back. Her voice, though small, carried clearly across the water. The whales responded immediately, their songs becoming more joyful, more celebratory. Other marine life began to appear. Dolphins leaping through the waves, seabirds circling overhead, even schools of fish visible just beneath the surface, all drawn by the extraordinary connection between the baby and the ocean. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood beside the family, tears streaming down her face. "In 40 years of studying marine life," she whispered, "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Captain Knox, who had insisted on accompanying them on the rescue ship, shook his head in amazement. "That little girl doesn't just talk to animals," he said quietly. "She sings to their souls." As the ship docked, the whales positioned themselves in the harbor, something that had never happened before in the port's long history. They floated peacefully in the water, their massive forms visible to everyone on shore, as if they were bidding farewell to their small friend. The media was waiting, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. But Willow seemed oblivious to the chaos. She was focused entirely on the whales, her small hand waving goodbye to each one. Dr. Santos approached Clara and Marcus with a thick folder of notes. "I've documented everything," she said. "But more importantly, I think I understand what we've witnessed here." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "Your daughter hasn't just discovered a way to communicate with animals," Santos explained. "She's reminded us of something we lost long ago. Humans used to live in harmony with nature. We used to understand that we're all connected, every living thing on this planet. Willow hasn't learned some new ability. She's simply never forgotten what we all knew once." Marcus felt a profound truth in those words. "So, what happens now?" Elena stepped forward. "Now, you have a choice. You can let the world turn Willow into a curiosity, a subject for study and analysis, or you can protect her gift and help her use it to heal the relationship between humans and the natural world." "We protect her," Clara said immediately, "always." As they prepared to disembark, Bear looked up at Willow and made a soft sound that was different from any he had made before. It was gentle, full of gratitude, and somehow final. Willow reached down and touched his head, her eyes filled with an understanding that transcended her young age. "He's saying goodbye," Dr. Santos realized. "The animals know they have to return to their own world now." But Willow shook her head. She made soft sounds to Bear, and his response was immediate and joyful. The tiger, which had been brought up from below deck for the arrival, approached and nuzzled Willow's hand. The other animals that had been rescued looked at her with what could only be described as devotion, They want to stay with her, Elena said in wonder. They've bonded with her completely. Captain Knox smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. Then maybe we need to find a new definition of family. 6 months later, the world had indeed changed. The Finch family had relocated to a special wildlife preserve that Elena had helped them establish, funded by donations from people around the globe who had been inspired by Willow's story. The preserve was unlike any other. It was a place where injured and orphaned animals could heal, where research into animal communication could be conducted ethically, and where the extraordinary bond between Willow and the creatures continued to flourish. Bear had grown larger, but remained Willow's constant companion. The tiger, now named Aurora by Willow's babbled attempts at words, served as a gentle guardian to both of them. The wolves had integrated into a pack structure that included Willow as an honorary member. The other animals thrived in an environment where they were not just protected, but truly understood. Scientists came from around the world to study what had become known as the Willow Protocol, a method of interspecies communication based on emotional resonance rather than dominance or training. But they had to follow strict rules, no invasive testing, no separation of bonded animals, and most importantly, no exploitation of Willow herself. Dr. Santos had been appointed as the preserve's director, with Elena as the chief research coordinator. Together, they documented the ongoing development of Willow's abilities, while ensuring her childhood remained as normal as possible. Marcus and Clara had found new purpose in their lives, too. They had become advocates for a different kind of conservation, one based on understanding and communication rather than mere protection. Their research papers were revolutionizing the field of animal psychology. But perhaps the most amazing part was that Willow's gift seemed to be growing. Other children who visited the preserve began showing similar abilities, as if Willow's presence was awakening something dormant in human consciousness. On a warm spring evening, as the sun set over the preserve, Willow sat by the shore of a small lake with Bear beside her. The whales that had rescued them still visited sometimes, their songs carrying across the ocean to reach her ears. When they called, she would sing back, her voice now more confident and clear. Aurora lay nearby, the massive tiger as gentle as a house cat in Willow's presence. The wolves rested in a loose circle around them, and various smaller animals roamed freely, unafraid and peaceful. Clara and Marcus watched from a distance, their hearts full of wonder at what their daughter had become. She was no longer just their baby. She was a bridge between worlds, a living reminder that love and understanding could overcome any barrier. As Willow sang to the setting sun, her voice carried on the wind. Birds joined in from the trees, fish began jumping in the lake, and even the insects seemed to harmonize with her melody. It was as if all of nature was celebrating the return of an ancient connection, a language older than words. Bear nuzzled close to Willow and made his soft, contented sounds. She hugged him tightly, and in that moment, everyone watching understood the truth that would reshape the world. Sometimes, the most extraordinary miracles come in the smallest packages. And sometimes, a child's pure heart can remind us all of what we're capable of when we remember how to listen to the voices that surround us every day. The stars began to appear overhead, and the ocean sang its eternal song. In a world that had forgotten how to hear nature's voice, a little girl and her bear friend had reminded everyone how to listen with their hearts. And in that listening, hope was reborn for a future where no creature would ever be alone, where every voice would be heard, and where the language of love would finally be understood by all. The baby, who had saved a bear cub from a sinking ship, had done something far greater. She had saved the connection between all living things, and in doing so she had saved hope itself. The story of Willow and Bear would be told for generations to come, inspiring countless others to listen for the voices that speak without words, to find connections that transcend species, and to remember that in a world full of differences, love remains the universal language that binds us all together. And somewhere in the ocean, the whales continued to sing, their voices carrying the message across the waves. The child who could speak to the heart of all living things had reminded the world how to be whole again.